Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you again, guys. I think that's the last time that we talked was yesterday, so it's been not that long, really. But I was inspired by some of the comments made to my previous video on the fact that I'm working on a book on the INFJ type, which I'm about 12,000 words in, I would say, at this point, just to give you an indication. And in one of the comments, a user whom whose comments I've been following for a while, and her name is Lolita. Don't know if it's her first name or username. Either way, Lolita often has quite interesting things to say, and often quite critical things to say in a good sense, in a sense that stimulates thinking. And this is the point that she made. She said a book called Metaphysics of the INFJ, in this case, right? Because that's the kind of working title of my book. Seems to suggest that there is a one INFJ type and that the metaphysics of this type, can be elucidated in a book. So this seems to presuppose a further thing, which is that there is only one unified INFJ type, and it is of this unified INFJ type that I propose to analyze the metaphysics. And what Lolita was saying was that, in fact, there are many different subtypes of INFJ, and in view of the fact that there are those many different subtypes, is it really possible, does it even make sense to write a book on the INFJ? I wanted to say the INFJ with a capital I, except that usually the type is, as I like any type, is written with a capital I and capital letters in general. But that's the kind of critique that Lolita suggested. And fundamentally, it reminds me of the broad, critique that postmodernism makes of modernism. I'm not going to go into the detail of this because I'm not sure you're familiar with the philosophy behind this, which translates into every aspect of culture, really. But the idea that there are stable concepts sort of started to disintegrate with the advent of postmodernity, and postmodernity questioned the unity of the concepts. In this case, it's the concept of an INFJ type, and the question whether the project that I have undertaken can really prove worthwhile in view of the subtypes. Now here's my answer. I've been thinking about this on my own a little bit, but I've also come to the conclusion that it's probably best to kind of keep the interaction relatively spontaneous, which is probably why I'm deciding to answer quite quickly, just so that the flow of my thought is still there and still developing, and hopefully the responses from other people will help that as well. It's an answer that I think I'm going to divide into different sections. The first section is the fact that there are subtypes of INFJs, regardless of how many subtypes there are. Is that really an issue? Is that really an issue from the perspective of writing a book on the INFJ type? Well, no matter how much I think of it, I cannot avoid the conclusion that it does not pose a problem. And the reason why it does not pose a problem is because those subtypes have something in common. Yes, they have something in common. Now, they're different subtypes, but they have things in common, right? What do they have in common? They have in common the fact that they are subtypes of the INFJ type. In other words, all these different subtypes with all these different peculiarities still share something fundamental, which is that they participate in the INFJ nature, if you want to put it in the language of the old metaphysics. And from this perspective, if I'm writing a book on the INFJ type, then there's no reason why the insights that are derived from that book couldn't apply to all the different INFJ subtypes, because the only condition is participating in the INFJ nature, in the INFJ type. It follows that regardless of what your subtype is, the content will relate to you. At least that's the idea. And I just want to say, because I'm aware of the fact that this answer is quite straightforward and direct. I think it works as an answer, to be honest. But I just want to illustrate it. I want to illustrate where it works and why it's really quite simple. You might be familiar with the works of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant wrote a lot on human nature. And he is, in some respects, you could argue, the inventor of the concept of human rights, which is operational pretty much throughout the world at this point. Immanuel Kant wrote on human nature, and he derived a number of essential categories, the Kantian categories and the Kantian faculties, to distinguish human nature from other types of natures, whether it be animal nature or the nature of things that don't have organic life or biological existence. But the fact is that free will, that rationality, that you could say, operating within legal systems. We all operate within legal systems. So you see free rationality are internal faculties, but operating within legal systems, operating within structured economic systems, these are external, not so much faculties as features of human society. All these pertain to human nature, and this is indubitable. You cannot really contest that. But this abstracts from the fact that every single human being is unique in some ways. No two single personalities are alike in the human world. So you can abstract fundamental traits and features of human nature, despite the fact that there are 8 billion different people, each with their own idiosyncrasies, who all have their personalities, who all have their types, presumably, as well. And that's completely fine, because it depends on the level of abstraction at which you're working. So there's no problem. There's no problem with writing a book on the INFJ type, even if there are subtypes. In fact, that's even better, because it means that the level of investigation of the book is sufficiently general. So that's the first element of the answer. Now there's a second element which could be potentially more controversial, because then it's not an answer that purely relies on logical thinking. It's more an answer that also draws from my particular approach to theories and to judging the merits of different models. I suspect that maybe Lolita was asking this question because although she was well aware of what I explained in the first section of my video, there are some people who subscribe to this idea that among subtypes of INFJs, there are subtypes, right? And this is where it gets more complicated, because we're starting to look into the actual subtypes. There are subtypes that exist beyond the well-known, accepted subtypes, which are NIFE, so FE-oriented INFJs, and NITI, TI-oriented INFJs. So you could think of a quintessential example of an NIFE INFJ as Jesus Christ. You could think of a quintessential NITI INFJ as Plato, maybe, or Ludwig Wittgenstein, Spinoza. A lot of INFJ philosophers rely, extensively on the thinking function, and Carl Jung, arguably, as well. So you have the social versus the intellectual INFJ. I mean, you could broadly categorize the type in, the subtypes that way. Now, that these subtypes, I'm not denying that they exist, and I can tell you that they accord perfectly well with whatever I'm writing on the INFJ's metaphysics in the book as a whole. That's not an issue. it becomes an issue when we start talking about subtypes of INFJ, such as, and Lolita's mentioned them, but I have other people. There was one person, and that really illustrates the problem with this view. There was one person who saw my video with my parents, and I introduced my dad as an ENFJ type, and he's like a quintessential ENFJ type, if I may say so. Always surrounded by people, like the most social person I know. An ENFJ, without a doubt. And the person in the comments said, I think he's more likely an INFJ FESE subtype. Right? And another subtype of INFJ is supposed to be TISC subtype. Right? So you have these two subtypes that I reject. I do not think that FESE INFJ subtypes make sense, because an INFJ by definition is an NI dominant, so the subtype will always be, it will always be dominated by definition by NI. So, FESE doesn't make sense. That's just an ENFJ, like my dad. And then TISC INFJ, it's almost like it makes even less sense, because again, the sort of, it seems as if the sort of predominant function is TI, and it's like, no, like the TI of an INFJ is actually mostly unconscious, and that's kind of the elements that I'm keeping from Jung, because it makes sense. If you allow all the functions to be conscious, then there's no longer any difference between any types that have similar function stacks. If you allow all the functions to be conscious to the same extent, there's no more difference between an INFJ and an ISTP, between an INFJ and an ESTP, between an INFJ and an ENFJ. That's the inevitable consequence, and that's why allowing for the existence of those subtypes is incoherent. It's not just inconsistent, it's incoherent. And the reason why I consider those subtypes to be incoherent is not because I am dogmatic about what the cognitive system is. It is true that I take from Jung a number of elements, but by no means everything. I judge every model on its own merits. At least I try to do that. It seems to me that there are aspects of the Jungian model that are still very strong, that are current, and perhaps partly because they really touch a truth that does not stand in need of that much further elucidation. Maybe, like the truth has been sort of reached. But a lot of other aspects stand in need of elucidation. I was saying to Lolita in my exchange with her that in Jung, and I'm reading Jung at the moment, so it's very, very current for me. Like, I read Jung, I'm reading the psychological types, because I'd read parts of the book, but now, and also as part of my enterprise, in my own book, I really am paying attention to what Jung wrote, and I can tell you there's a lot of rudimentary crudeness in Jung's articulation of the types. There are absolutely brilliant flashes of insight that you're unlikely to find anywhere else, and insight that still stand, but there's also crudeness, his distinction between extroversion and introversion is rudimentary. It has been improved upon since then, including by Myers and Briggs. His distinction between thinking and feeling is crude to a certain extent, and I think that he fails to fully appreciate the different dimensions of the feeling function. And his, maybe partly because he was himself an intuitive, a dominant intuitive, I think his exploration of the intuitive types is quite good. It can still be improved. It's still quite good, but his conceptualization of the sensing functions is also rudimentary. So you see, I'm really not saying that Jung can never be surpassed. He ought to be surpassed, because a theory by its very nature sets a stage for eventually being surpassed by another theory that could not have surpassed it without the existence of the prior theory in the first place. That's how science functions, essentially. But with all that being said, and I address these topics in my book, I do criticize Jung a fair bit in my book from a respectful perspective, just as another philosopher, writer, if you like. Even if I do that, it doesn't mean that I'm going to accept just anything that is said that does not accord with Jung. And this idea of like TISE and S or FESE subtypes of INFJ, to me, is just unacceptable, not because it does not accord with Jung, but because it's incoherent. It's incoherent because the SE function is mostly like 99% of the time unconscious, you know. And yes, that's what Jung says, and I think he's right. Because if you, again, and I know that some current models pretend that all the functions can be conscious, you lose all the differentiation between types that's with similar function stacks. Because primarily the reason why functions are ordered in a certain order in a function stack is because they're ordered by level of conscious use. The more conscious, the higher in the stack, right? So that's really my answer. You know, I look at the strengths of different theories. I'm critical of the old. I'm critical of the new. I'm critical of my own theory. You know, my own insights. Certainly, the merits have to, you know, sort of be extracted from the theory itself. The demerits can be extracted from two sort of parameters. You can extract the demerits in comparison with better theories, that's true, but you can also, and in this case that's what I did, extract the demerits by looking at the theory and looking at its inconsistencies and incoherences. It's extremely difficult to build an explanatorily satisfactory theory, an ambitious theory, which is at the same time internally fully coherent and fully consistent. I'm not saying it's easy to achieve, it's actually extremely difficult to achieve. And some amazing scientists and theorists never managed to achieve a completely consistent and coherent theory, and they still contributed a lot to their disciplines. So it's not the be all and end all. I'm just saying there are good grounds for taking the approach that I do, and it does not mean that I have not thought about these topics before. I have thought about them at length and as seriously as I can. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you think, and we can continue the discussion as it goes. You know, hopefully those will be also ideas for me to incorporate in the book. I need to be stimulated, so I thank you all very much for taking care of my stimulation. Ciao.